Have you ever negotiated with a difficult person? You're not going to want to miss this episode. The art of dealing with difficult people. Negotiations don't just happen in the boardroom. They happen in everyday life. I'm Susie Tomenchok, expert negotiator, author, and TEDx speaker. I'm glad you're here. I'm going to show you the art of negotiation without manipulation so you can level up, know your worth, and adopt a negotiator mindset. Let's go. Welcome, friends. I'm Susie. I'm so glad you made the choice to be here today, especially for a really difficult episode to talk about because it's about difficult personalities. And this came up for me because a really close friend of mine, James, had told me that he recently got a new boss. His longtime boss had retired, and so he got a new boss, and it was a peer of his before. And he realized that it was really difficult working with him. And the reason is he identified his boss as a narcissist. And I am not an expert at all in dealing with narcissism, but I'm going to talk about it through James's lens and what James did to really counteract that. And what James was experiencing when this person became his boss was that this person wanted full control. James still was acting like he normally did. He would, own the things that he was supposed to own. He would own the budget and the presentation of that. And his boss wasn't liking that at all. And so his boss stopped inviting him to meetings. He was very negative with him, didn't listen to him, didn't listen to his ideas, just was self-centered and self-focused. And James was like, I am working many layers lower than I should be now. And what happens when we're working with difficult people, and it doesn't mean that every one of them is a narcissist. Sometimes we deal with difficult people because they're stressed. And so some bad elements of their personality come out, or they're really pushy because they need to get what they want. And what happens is that really evokes emotion in us. And so emotion hampers our ability to think. It makes us react and get defensive. So dealing with difficult people, the first thing to do is to just self-identify that this is going to be a challenge and really thinking about how am I going to get through it, even though it is. It doesn't mean you get to just walk away. And James knew that. In his case, he really needed to think about how was he going to manage up to this boss? What was he going to change in his approach to get and move through this? Because James didn't want to leave, and he didn't want to be just working so under his potential after all these years of hard work. And he had a lot of trust with people within the organization. Not having that just felt so empty to him. So he read a lot about personalities like his bosses, what he needed to do, asked for advice from his counterparts that he trusted on how to really approach. And so what James started realizing is he needed to manage differently. He needed to show up differently so that his boss would start to trust him and bring him in. And that can be really difficult to do, but taking a step back and getting some objectivity, some help, some support is really important. And I'm going to talk about some of the situations that I've faced with difficult people, sometimes expected, sometimes unexpected. So many times we go into a conversation and we assume that we have all of the data that we need. We have all the lever points. We know exactly how we want to move through it. But then they put a wrench in it, or they're distracted by something, or they're upset about something. And while we have an agenda and we know what we want to get through, we need to think about what do we need to shift on the other side of the table? What do we need to shift in them to get them to understand where we want them to go? It's not manipulation. It's about serving up what they need to move through the conversation, to get them out if that's what you need to do, to get a yes if that's what you need, to get commitment, to really think about what do you adjust in you to get what you need from the other side of the table. So when we come back, I'll talk about some examples of this where I've seen it myself, where I've seen it in some of my clients, and what they did to counteract that. let's dig right in. Let's talk first about James and how he countered his boss. He learned that his boss needed to be really self-directed or self-focused. So instead of fighting it in his one-on-ones, he would come expecting that his boss wanted to talk about himself. And everything that James would bring up to him, he would first ask for his advice and ask him to give him what he needed to move forward or what he thought that James should do. And what started shifting was his boss was less defensive against James. I think he started learning that, well, probably not consciously, that James was doing the best he could to manage him so that he was less defensive against him. And so unfortunately, it changes his boss's focus onto other people and other situations. And that's just what he did. But that allowed James to have a little bit more autonomy and learn how to really work well with the situation at hand. So James is so much happier now. And it just took him some time to test the waters around that, to understand what was important to his boss and shift that narrative of how he approached his one-on-ones, the budget conversations, to how to get himself invited and show up in a way that made his boss feel really comfortable with him being at the table. Because as long as he learned kind of those rules, his boss didn't put a focus so much on him. Such a unfortunate situation, but an important thing to think about. Sometimes we can't just maneuver and just do it our way. We really need to think about how do we show up differently. And it also reminds me of a situation that I had professionally. I was working with a peer that was in a satellite office. And my expectation of this meeting is we were just going to talk about how we're going to move through this project that we were working on. He was senior to me and his team was really integral to the success of the project. We were the operational arm and he was the software arm. So we needed to make sure that we were coordinated on dates and deliverables together. And while my expectation for the meeting was that we were just kind of a dialogue about where we were, his expectation was that I was going to have answers for him. And so what happened was I started to just kind of go into my agenda and he got really heated really quick. And I remember so heated that he started yelling at me and shaming me for not realizing what he needed from this meeting. And at first I was so unarmed by not knowing what to do. It was so surprising to me that it was so unexpected that I was going to have to deal with this tension. He was actually a really nice guy most of the time and we got along really well. And so seeing him in this way was the first time I had seen it. I had heard about it in the hallways sometimes that he didn't get along with some people, but I had never seen it myself. So at first I was so taken aback that I got really silent and I let him go. And I think it really helped to give him the platform to get frustrated at me. And I honestly didn't know what to do. So I stayed silent, which was a good strategy at the time, just to let him go through. And I started thinking, okay, what do I need to do to recuperate the relationship? And so in that moment, I said, you know what, I need some time. He wasn't happy about that, but I asked for an hour and then to come back to him. And so I really got my to-dos in order and really thought about what he needed and then came back to him an hour later. And we had a really great discussion, but man, he was so upset at me. And I just remember being not prepared and so surprised. And that surprise inhibits us the most. The chemistry in your body really has an abrupt approach because in the research it says anger and surprise are the two things that really cloud us, that really take us off our game. And I can really see that his reaction too. I had a little bit of both, right? I had his anger, which was unexpected. And just seeing him that way was such a surprise to me that I just didn't know what to do. So that was one example. And then in a more traditional negotiation, difficult personalities can be the ones that have their own process that they go through. And if you don't check and tie all the boxes along the way, then they get really out of sorts. They don't really like it. And I remember I was negotiating with a government contract and they had this very specific way of going through. And our way was so different from theirs. And what happened was I started getting confused about what his issues were because the process was confusing me on top of the points he was making. Because you had to follow these steps, those seemed more important than the money piece or what we were talking about that was contractually part of the negotiation. So difficult personality can also show up in a way that you have to think about how they're thinking it through. He seemed like he was so difficult to deal with because he asked so many questions and got so stuck in this process. And I was so focused on the deal points of the deal that we were missing in communication. And so what I realized was I started asking more questions of him to really understand why he was staying in the process of what we needed to go through to get done. And so it had to do a lot with the paperwork that we had to move through first before we went on to the next thing. And I thought it was a stall tactic. And so once I realized, I had him explain, I said, I think I'm missing what's important to you. So help me. And we zoomed out. I zoomed out and allowed us both to look at it differently. Because what happens is so often when we deal with a difficult personality, we get so zoomed in on what the detail is that we're working on that we miss the reason why. And we get so stuck in why they're thinking the way they are. And so when we don't understand, what can happen to the other party is then they get more frustrated and their emotions start happening. And then they show up as this angry or frustrated personality, this difficult personality. And we may have been a factor in creating that unintentionally. Zooming out and realizing what's going on and being really clear, because part of what I missed in that negotiation was that if we had talked about what the process looked like, how we were going to move through it, what the goal was for both of us, he wouldn't have gotten frustrated. I wouldn't have gotten confused, and we would have been on the same page to move through it. We ended up working through it, but communication is one of the most important factors in negotiation that gets missed and is not clearly understood by both parties. And it is the most often the problem is really the communication that happens. And in a difficult conversation, a difficult person, that can really magnify because our focus is not on the right place to provide the solution. I'll talk more about what are we going to stop, start, and continue around the tips that you should consider when working with difficult personalities. So stay right where you are. What I've learned is that difficult people can be the person, it can be the situation. We can complicate it as well. And not being prepared is really essential. And what I want to do is talk about the stop, start, and continue and think about in your mind what you can do to combat what happens to you in a situation where you're dealing with somebody that may be narcissistic. It could be somebody that's just really difficult and they use these emotions against you. And sometimes those people, narcissism is something that is definitely a part of the personality of people, and people are going to have those attributes sometimes that you have to be aware of. But also people have learned over time and sometimes don't mean to do it consciously, but they use anger when they feel like I don't know what else to do. So I'm just going to get mad. And that worked for them in the past because anger or emotion, high emotion, can get the other person to move away really quickly. So over time, I've negotiated against somebody who was like that. And I could tell that he would use those emotions because he realized that it worked. And when I've gone back and interviewed people, and especially people that have used negative tactics, not always do they admit, maybe they don't admit, but a lot of times from their response to me, I can tell that they didn't intentionally apply that negative tactic. They just realized over time that it worked. So keep that in mind because sometimes we make things worse by the way we react and how we allow the situation to escalate a little bit more because we didn't have the right response or the best reaction to it. So let's start there with stop. So when I think about stopping, what are you going to stop doing? What am I going to stop doing? But what are some of the things that we can stop doing that can get in our way? And the first one is to stop reacting emotionally. If you can feel that something is becoming high stakes for you, you're becoming triggered by the other person, really check yourself on how you're responding to it. And when you feel yourself responding emotionally, see what you can do to turn that down, take a break, get objectivity, whatever you need to do. And especially if you know it's going to happen, have a plan on how you're going to combat that emotion. We can't turn it off, but we can decide what we're going to do in those moments when it comes up. And when we respond in that way, that could get the other person even more triggered, or it could allow them to see that they're getting what they want. So just cutting that off can be really helpful in working with somebody like that. The other thing I want you to think about stopping is the distractions. That behavior can distract you from what's important. You might start talking about that, or it becomes the topic. Like if it's somebody that it's a peer of yours and they have those tendencies to start to be difficult or be self-focused, get back to what's important. Don't allow that distraction to get you tied in. So then the conversation starts sounding like you always react this way, or you never look at it from somebody else's perspective. So you're reacting to them as a person. Stopping that distraction and also stopping thinking about that emotion in you. What I want you to think about is to start. What are you going to start doing? And starting around reframing the conversation, even being able to think in your mind, if I need to reframe this so they understand how it is centered around them. How can I restate this in a way that allows them to see, I've been thinking about this and I wanted to approach this for you. And I really thought about what are your interests? Maybe that would help that narcissistic personality. It might help that other person that wants to feel like they're being heard. Sometimes people become difficult because they don't feel like they're being heard. And so they get really aggressive because they're not getting what they want. And that's their only way of defending against that. And then in the moment, which is really hard, another thing to start doing is really pausing, inserting silence, changing the cadence. What that does is it interrupts that disruption. It sometimes allows the other person to really think about what they're saying. All of a sudden, it's not this combat thing back and forth. And when you disrupt that cadence back and forth, they will disrupt their pattern as well. So using silence, repeating, really trying to understand and slow down can be such a great way of getting yourself to get in the here and now, zoom out to get a little bit of objectivity, because when you create that change, it allows you to get some more perspective. I always like that idea of zooming out and thinking about, okay, I'm too close to it. I need to zoom out. I'm too emotional. I'm reacting to the situation. What do I need to do to get a different perspective? And changing the cadence can be really, really helpful there. So what to continue to do? Asking questions and getting clarification about what's important to them. When you change that cadence and you turn the dialogue on them, that allows them to feel like they're being heard because they're talking. It allows you to deeply understand, listen for what they're saying so that you can reframe it in a way that they can understand it, or hear it in a way that they're going to move through, get past the things that are getting them stuck, and then really continue to evolve your emotional agility. I talk about this in one of my sections about emotional agility, and it's all about recognizing whether it's our gender, whether it's our personality, whether it's who we are and our strengths, understanding what might get in our way allows us to have this agility in the moment to go, what am I going to apply? What do I do really well? Me being an extrovert might be getting in my way because I'm talking so much that I'm not allowing the other person to say anything. So they're not feeling like they have equal footing in the conversation. So having that awareness and thinking about that agility that you need to apply in that moment can be something that's very powerful to consider and always work through and work on. So what are you going to stop doing? What gets in your way? Take some time to really reflect on that. It's important for us to consider what are the things that we can adjust, because when we adjust, we can affect the other side differently and we can change the conversation literally. So what are you going to stop doing? What are you going to start doing? And what are you going to continue doing? I want you to personally think about what would be most effective for you. What is in your control? What is in your ability in that moment? What can I do to shift something so that I can show up differently and enable them to show up differently so that whatever is being discussed, whatever's being negotiated, whatever's being agreed upon, you can get through to that end and maneuver and navigate and negotiate the personalities, the emotions along the way. Stick with me. I'll be right back. I'm just going to give us a little cap off and get you on your way. But I really want you to have a really sound takeaway and a change, a shift that you're going to do for you. I'll be right back. I think it's important to step back to consider ourselves and how we might be even getting in our own way. Although we're always going to come across difficult personalities, especially one like narcissism that is just who they are. And it is really hard for us to understand that perspective. So take some time. If you are working with somebody that has a difficult personality, do some research about it. There's a lot of great resources online that give you tips on how to deal with different people because you're not the first one. And then remember that these difficult personalities can be situational. They can be something that maybe you're contributing to. So think about those stop, start, and continue. Stop reacting emotionally. Stop being interrupted by the disruptions of that personality or the situation. Stop in the moment to understand what you need to do. Start reframing. Really use that reframe. That's such a powerful way to reorient the conversation, not only for you, but for the other person. And start to change the pace. Insert pausing, silence. That will allow you some time, but also it will interrupt their habit of how they're communicating with you. See what happens. Not only that clarity of mind when you're doing that, but also observe what happens in that moment and how it helps. And then when you continue, think about what's getting in your way. Continue to clarify by asking questions, understand it from their side, and continue to build that emotional agility. There's so much power in really understanding how we're showing up, how we can work with ourselves to get better at being agile, being understanding of what's getting in our way, zooming out so that we can see it from a different perspective. It can be really helpful for us to get to the end, being clear on what the end you want to get to. Oh, such a difficult subject. Can be really hard. And it's really important to consider because sometimes we get into this mode. I remember one of my peers that was really difficult. I would just always go into fight mode. And so if that's you, think about what you need to do to unlock that for yourself so that you can try something different with these tips that you can show up differently as well. That can be really helpful. So I would love for you to continue the conversation. I talk about these things in my weekly newsletter, Adopting a Negotiator Mindset. So go to negotiationlove.com. There's also the QR code that you can go to the show notes to find that. And I'd love for you to sign up and just get some benefit in your email box every week, not every day. I'm so glad you made the decision to be here today. Good for you. We're always shifting. And don't forget that negotiation is more than a skill. It's a mindset. Until next time.